The chamber was designed to intimidate. Vast, luminous, and impossibly precise, it stretched far beyond what human architecture would ever attempt, its curved walls shimmering with layered energy fields that displayed the emblems of dozens of civilizations. Each delegation occupied its own elevated platform, arranged in a perfect circle around a central void where decisions were made and power was measured. This was where species proved their worth, or were quietly dismissed. Humanity stood in that void. They were new. Not technologically impressive, not politically influential, and certainly not respected. Their arrival had been noted more out of curiosity than concern. A species that had only recently stopped fighting itself, that still divided its world with invisible lines and competing ideologies, had somehow managed to step into a galaxy that had long since moved beyond such inefficiencies. To many of those present, it was almost amusing. The first voice to break the silence carried a tone of polite disdain. It spoke of Earth as if it were a case study, a cautionary tale. Wars, resource conflicts, unstable governments, these were not whispered criticisms, but openly listed failures. Other delegates joined in, layering their observations with clinical detachment. Humanity was described as volatile, emotionally driven, and dangerously unpredictable. Some questioned whether a species like that should even be allowed representation. A ripple of subdued laughter followed. It wasn't loud, not crude, but unmistakably dismissive. A few species exchanged signals of agreement, their equivalent of smirks. One diplomat went further, suggesting that humanity's greatest achievement was surviving itself long enough to reach the stars, not because of intelligence, but by sheer accident. Another implied that given enough time, humans would inevitably destroy their own progress, just as they had done repeatedly throughout their history. Through it all, the human delegation did not react. There were no interruptions, no attempts to defend or justify. They stood quietly, listening. Their posture was steady, their expressions composed. To those watching, it appeared as submission, perhaps even embarrassment. But there was something else there, something harder to define. Not defiance, not pride, something closer to patience. One of the elder species observed this with interest. Unlike the others, it did not join in the mockery. Its kind had existed long enough to recognize patterns others ignored. It had seen civilizations rise rapidly, dismissed for their flaws, only to reveal strengths that had gone unnoticed. The humans, standing silent in the center of judgment, reminded it of those rare exceptions. But the chamber was not interested in exceptions. The verdict came in the form of limitation. Humanity would not be granted equal standing. Not yet. Their role would be observational, their influence minimal. They would be allowed to learn, to adapt, to prove themselves over time, if they survived that long. It was delivered as a measured decision, but the implication was clear. They were not trusted, not valued, and certainly not needed. Another wave of quiet approval followed. Only then did one of the human representatives step forward. The movement was small, almost insignificant compared to the grandeur surrounding them, yet it drew attention simply because it broke the pattern of silence. When the human spoke, the voice was calm, unhurried, and completely devoid of resentment. "We understand your concerns." There was no attempt to argue against the accusations, no denial of humanity's past. The acknowledgement seemed to disarm some of the tension, if only slightly. "We are not here to convince you of what we are," the human continued. "That would take time. Experience. Perspective." A pause followed, just long enough for the words to settle. "But we will be here when you need us." It was not a challenge. It was not a threat. It was simply a statement. To most of the chamber, it sounded almost naive. A species barely tolerated, speaking as if it held some unseen value. A few delegates dismissed it outright, turning their attention elsewhere, already considering the matter concluded. Yet not all of them. Some heard something different beneath those words. Not arrogance, not desperation, certainty. A quiet, unshaken belief that did not depend on recognition or approval. It lingered in the chamber long after the humans stepped back, returning to their place without ceremony. The council moved on. Other matters demanded attention, more immediate, more important. Humanity faded from focus as quickly as it had entered. But the words remained, unnoticed by many, remembered by a few, and understood by none. The first reports were dismissed as anomalies. A remote outpost fell silent without distress signals, its systems intact but unresponsive. Then another vanished from monitoring networks, not destroyed, not damaged, simply gone from every known form of detection. At first, it was attributed to malfunction, perhaps an experimental technology failure or localized disruption. The galaxy had grown comfortable with its own stability, and anything that didn't fit established patterns was quickly rationalized. That comfort didn't last. Within days, entire sectors began to flicker with irregularities. Trade routes collapsed as vessels disappeared mid-transit. Automated defense grids activated without visible targets, firing into empty space as if responding to something no sensor could identify. Communication relays distorted, transmitting fragments of signals that made no sense, echoes of something moving through networks rather than across physical space. Panic didn't erupt immediately. It spread slowly, quietly, like a realization no one wanted to fully accept. The first true confirmation came when a heavily fortified world, one of the most secure in the known systems, issued a full emergency broadcast. It wasn't a call for assistance, it was a warning. Their fleets had engaged an unknown presence. Weapons had locked onto it, targeting something that registered as both present and absent at the same time. Energy discharges passed through it without resistance, yet moments later, entire ships began to shut down from within, their systems overridden by something that shouldn't have been able to breach them. Then the transmission cut off. No debris. No aftermath. Just silence. By the time the council reconvened, the tone had shifted completely. The same chamber that had once echoed with subtle mockery now carried a sharp edge of urgency. Delegates spoke over one another, their composure fracturing as more reports flooded in. Entire defense fleets were rendered useless within minutes of contact. Advanced predictive systems failed to model the threat because it didn't behave according to any known logic. It adapted faster than any algorithm could compensate. Some called it an intelligence. Others argued it was a phenomenon, something beyond the concept of life entirely. Whatever it was, it ignored conventional rules. It did not conquer territory in the traditional sense. It erased function. Systems stopped working. Structures lost cohesion. Entire infrastructures collapsed without visible cause. For the first time in generations, the galaxy was facing something it could not understand. Attempts to counter it followed the same pattern. Precision strikes, coordinated fleets, layered defenses, every strategy built on order and predictability failed. The more structured the response, the faster it was dismantled. It was as if the threat anticipated logic itself, moving through it, around it, dismantling it piece by piece. The realization came slowly, and it was deeply unsettling. Their greatest strength had become a weakness. The civilizations in that chamber had evolved past chaos. Their systems were efficient, their decisions calculated, their responses optimized. They had eliminated unpredictability from their processes long ago. But now, they were facing something that thrived in the absence of rules, something that didn't follow patterns because it didn't need to. And they had no answer for it. Silence fell as the weight of that truth settled in. Then, quietly at first, a question emerged. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but it spread quickly through the chamber. A memory resurfaced, uncomfortable and inconvenient. Humanity. The same species they had dismissed. The same one defined by unpredictability, by conflict, by a history filled with adaptation under pressure. Everything that had been used to justify their exclusion now stood in stark contrast to the problem at hand. There was immediate resistance. Some rejected the idea outright, unwilling to entertain the possibility that a primitive civilization could offer solutions where advanced ones had failed. Pride held firm, even as systems continued to fall and reports grew more desperate. But pride did not stop the spread. World after world went dark. Fleets were lost without explanation. Entire regions of space became inaccessible, as if something had rewritten the rules that governed them. The Council could no longer pretend this was temporary or containable. They were losing. Reluctance gave way to necessity. The decision was made without ceremony. No grand declaration, no acknowledgement of past judgments. Just a quiet, unanimous agreement born from the absence of alternatives. A message was sent. Not as a command, not as an equal request, but something in between. Carefully worded, stripped of arrogance, but not yet free of it. They asked for insight, for assistance, for anything that could slow what they could not stop. Then they waited. For the first time since humanity had stood in that chamber, the galaxy found itself looking toward Earth, not with curiosity or dismissal, but with something far less comfortable. Hope, forced into existence by fear. The response from Earth did not arrive with urgency or alarm. It came measured, structured, and complete, as if the situation had already been studied long before the message was ever received. There were no demands, no references to past insults, no hesitation. Only a request for full data access and unrestricted observation of all affected systems. It was granted immediately. What followed unsettled the Council more than the threat itself. Human analysts did not begin with solutions. They began with questions the others had not considered worth asking. Instead of focusing on the enemy's strength, they examined its inconsistencies. Instead of trying to define what it was, they studied what it wasn't doing. Patterns emerged, not in the attacks, but in the gaps between them. Where the presence had passed, there were traces, subtle disruptions that didn't align with total erasure. Something was being avoided. The conclusion formed quickly. The threat wasn't unstoppable. It was selective. Humanity's approach shifted instantly. They stopped treating the phenomenon as an overwhelming force and started treating it as a system with limitations. That alone was enough to change everything. While alien fleets prepared for large-scale engagements, human directives recommended something else entirely: smaller units, decentralized control, unpredictable movement. It contradicted every established doctrine. At first, the Council resisted. Their strategies had always relied on precision and coordination, flawless execution across massive fleets. Fragmentation meant inefficiency, and inefficiency meant weakness. But weakness was already evident. Reluctantly, they allowed a single trial under human guidance. A minor system, already on the brink of collapse, became the test. Human operators didn't deploy overwhelming force. They sent a scattered formation, vessels moving without synchronized patterns, adjusting positions constantly, refusing to follow predictable routes. Communication between them was minimal, deliberately inconsistent. It looked disorganized, almost reckless. The entity responded. For the first time, its movements were not instantaneous. It hesitated, not in time, but in execution. Its usual precision faltered as it attempted to adapt to inputs that did not follow logical progression. Attacks became less efficient, spreading across multiple targets instead of neutralizing them systematically. The disruption was small, but undeniable. Then the humans escalated. Instead of stabilizing their formation, they introduced more variables. Erratic maneuvers, conflicting signals, deliberate misdirection. They created noise, controlled chaos that forced the entity to process more possibilities than it could immediately resolve. Its advantage had always been prediction. Now it was being denied that. For the first time since its emergence, it made a mistake. One of its incursions failed completely, dissipating without effect as it miscalculated the position of its target. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it proved something critical. The threat could be confused. Shock rippled through the observing fleets. Entire civilizations had thrown their most advanced technologies at this enemy, and achieved nothing. Humanity had introduced disorder, and it had worked. Analysis spread rapidly. What the aliens had spent centuries eliminating, uncertainty, emotional decision-making, deviation from logic, humans had refined into a tool. Their history of conflict, of adapting to unpredictable conditions, had given them something no advanced system could replicate: the ability to operate without needing perfect information. More human recommendations followed, each one challenging established norms. Abandon centralized command structures. Allow individual units to make independent decisions. Encourage variation, even if it reduced efficiency on paper. The goal was no longer perfection. It was disruption. Implementation was uneven at first. Some fleets adapted quickly, others struggled to abandon doctrines ingrained over generations. But the results were consistent. Wherever human strategies were applied, the entity's progress slowed. Not stopped, but hindered. For the first time, the galaxy was no longer entirely on the defensive. The perception of humanity began to shift. Reports described their methods as unrefined, even chaotic, yet undeniably effective. They took risks others would never consider, making decisions that seemed irrational until they produced results. They didn't rely on certainty. They operated within uncertainty, using it as leverage. One of the diplomats who had once mocked them reviewed the data in silence. The same traits that had been labeled as flaws were now the only reason any resistance was possible. It wasn't that humans lacked control. It was that they understood when control was a limitation. Another message was sent to Earth, this time different in tone. It wasn't a request for help anymore. It was a request for direction. The reply was immediate. Humanity accepted, not with authority, but with quiet readiness. Humanity did not impose order on the coalition. Instead, it dismantled the illusion that order alone would win the war. The unified fleets that once moved like a single organism were broken apart into adaptive clusters, each given autonomy to interpret, react, and evolve in real time. It felt wrong to many of the older civilizations, like abandoning centuries of progress, yet the results left little room for argument. The new strategy did not aim to overpower the enemy. It aimed to exhaust it. Human planners identified a critical limitation within the entity's behavior. It could process vast amounts of information, but it still required coherence to act efficiently. When faced with structured opposition, it thrived, predicting outcomes before they occurred. But when confronted with overlapping variables, contradictory movements, erratic signals, constantly shifting objectives, it was forced to divide its attention. And division, even at its scale, created delay. Delay was all humanity needed. Operations began across multiple systems simultaneously. Small units executed independent maneuvers, never repeating patterns, never holding positions longer than necessary. Some engagements appeared deliberately wasteful, drawing the entity into actions that yielded no strategic value. Others focused on preserving critical infrastructure, not through defense, but through constant relocation and disguise. Entire stations were moved, hidden within debris fields or masked behind fluctuating energy signatures. To an outside observer, it looked chaotic. To the entity, it became increasingly difficult to interpret. The coalition followed, unevenly at first, but with growing confidence. Species that had once relied on flawless coordination began to experiment with controlled unpredictability. Command structures shifted from rigid hierarchies to fluid networks, where decisions could originate from any level. It was inefficient by every traditional metric. It was also working. The entity's expansion slowed further. Humanity then introduced the next phase. Rather than reacting to incursions, they began shaping them. False patterns were seeded across affected regions, carefully designed to appear consistent enough to attract the entity's attention. These patterns mimicked the structured logic it preferred, presenting opportunities too optimal to ignore. When it responded, it found itself entering environments already altered, fields saturated with interference, zones where physical laws had been subtly manipulated, regions prepared not for defense, but for confusion. The first major success came when an entire segment of the entity's presence destabilized. It attempted to process conflicting inputs, overlapping probabilities that could not all be true. Its response fractured, spreading across multiple false targets, weakening its influence in each. Coalition forces moved in, not to destroy, but to isolate. Containment replaced confrontation. This was the turning point. For the first time, the entity was not advancing. It was reacting. Encouraged by the shift, humanity accelerated its approach. Larger operations were launched, still fragmented in execution but unified in purpose. Decas, misdirection, and environmental manipulation became primary tools. Fleets no longer sought victory through force. They sought to overwhelm the enemy's ability to decide. Not all missions succeeded. Losses occurred, some significant. Human units were often the ones placed at the highest risk, operating closest to the entity's influence, pushing strategies to their limits. They accepted this without hesitation, not as sacrifice, but as necessity. Each failure provided data, each encounter refined the approach. The coalition began to understand. Perfection had never been the goal. Adaptation was. A final plan emerged, built on everything learned so far. Instead of targeting the entity directly, humanity proposed collapsing the framework it relied on. By flooding it with layered contradictions across multiple systems, forcing it to process an impossible volume of inconsistent data, they could push it beyond its operational threshold. Not destruction, but disintegration of function. Execution required absolute commitment. Every participating force would need to act independently yet contribute to the same objective. Timing would not be synchronized. It would be deliberately staggered, creating a cascade of interference that no centralized intelligence could resolve in time. Approval came without debate. The operation unfolded across the galaxy, each action seemingly disconnected, yet all contributing to the same pressure. Signals overlapped, movements conflicted, realities blurred at the edges of perception. The entity responded as it always had, by trying to understand. This time, it couldn't. Its presence fractured further, spreading too thin, reacting to threats that weren't real, missing those that were. Containment fields held. Zones once lost began to stabilize. The unstoppable advance halted, then reversed. For the first time since the crisis began, the galaxy was no longer surviving. It was winning. Silence returned to the galaxy slowly, not as an abrupt end, but as the absence of something that had once been everywhere. Systems that had gone dark flickered back to life. Communication networks stabilized. Long-abandoned sectors began transmitting signals again, fragmented at first, then clear. The presence that had defied understanding did not vanish in a single moment. It unraveled, its fragments losing cohesion until there was nothing left to hold them together. What remained was not victory in the traditional sense. There were no celebrations, no triumphant declarations echoing across the stars. Too much had been lost for that. Entire regions had been altered beyond recognition. Civilizations that once stood as pillars of stability now faced the reality of rebuilding from near collapse. The cost had been immense. And yet they were still there. The council chamber filled once more, but it was no longer the same place it had been. The polished certainty that once defined it had been replaced by something quieter, heavier. Delegates who had once spoken with effortless authority now carried the weight of experience they could not ignore. They had faced something beyond their control, and they had survived only because they had accepted help from those they had dismissed. Humanity did not arrive with ceremony. Their representatives entered as they had before, without display, without expectation. There was no change in their demeanor, no sign that they viewed the outcome as a personal triumph. To them, this had not been about proving anything. It had been about solving a problem. For a moment, no one spoke. The same diplomats who had once reduced humanity to a list of flaws now struggled to find words that carried the right meaning. Gratitude felt insufficient. Apology felt incomplete. What had been done could not be undone, and what had been proven could not be ignored. One of them finally stepped forward. There was no trace of superiority left in the gesture, only acknowledgement. The words that followed were measured, deliberate, and entirely sincere. They spoke of misjudgment, of assumptions built on incomplete understanding. They admitted that they had mistaken difference for weakness, unpredictability for instability. They had believed that progress meant eliminating chaos, when in reality, it had only limited their ability to face it. Humanity listened, just as they had before. There was no satisfaction in their response, no indication that they had been waiting for this moment. When they spoke, it was with the same calm clarity that had defined them from the beginning. They did not dismiss the apology, but they did not dwell on it either. What mattered was what came next. The council offered them a place among its highest ranks, not as observers, not as provisional members, but as equals. It was more than a symbolic gesture. It was an acknowledgement that the balance of understanding had changed. The galaxy no longer saw humanity as something to evaluate, but as something to learn from. The offer was accepted without hesitation, but also without ceremony. What surprised the council most was what followed. Humanity did not seek to reshape the existing systems in their own image. They did not attempt to impose their methods or claim authority over the structures that had once excluded them. Instead, they shared what they had learned, not as instruction, but as perspective. Adaptability was not something that could be forced. It had to be developed, understood, integrated over time. The greatest shift was not in power, but in mindset. Species that had once prided themselves on flawless precision began to reconsider the value of imperfection. Systems were redesigned, not to eliminate unpredictability, but to accommodate it. Decision-making evolved, allowing for flexibility where there had once been rigidity. The lesson was not that chaos should replace order, but that both were necessary. Humanity became a constant presence within the council, not dominating discussions, but influencing them in subtle, lasting ways. Their approach did not rely on control, but on resilience. They did not claim to have all the answers, only the willingness to face questions others avoided. In time, the memory of the crisis would fade, as all things eventually do. But its impact would remain, embedded in the way the galaxy understood itself. And in quiet moments, when new challenges emerged and uncertainty returned, there was a recognition that had not existed before. Strength was not defined by perfection. It was defined by the ability to endure what could not be predicted, to adapt when certainty failed, and to stand firm when everything else fell apart. Humanity had never needed to prove it. They had simply been ready when it mattered.